The criminal profiling process is defined by the FBI as a technique used to identify the perpetrator of a violent crime by identifying the personality and behavioral characteristics of the offender based upon an analysis of the crime committed. Abstract. The process generally involves 1. Evaluation of the criminal act itself, 2. Comprehensive evaluation of the specifics of the crime scenes, 3. Comprehensive analysis of the victim, and 4. Evaluation of preliminary police reports. Additional steps are 5. Evaluation of the medical examiner's autopsy protocol, 6. Development of a profile with critical offender characteristics, and 7. Investigative suggestions predicated on construction of the profile. Criminal profiling is particularly useful in hostage negotiation and identification of writers of threatening letters, rapists, arsonists, and sexual murderers. The FBI's profiling program has grown very rapidly since the 1970s and now consists of 1 program manager and 7 criminal profilers and crime analysts. They are assisted by criminal profile coordinators located at the FBI's 59 field offices. Criminal profilers at the FBI may also provide interrogation and interview techniques, establish probable cause for search warrants, and provide testimony as expert witnesses. Criminal profiling is not a substitute for skilled detective work, but it is a tool that the detective can use to help solve a violent crime. 7 references.
Profiling aims to identify the major personality and behavioral characteristics of offenders from their interactions in the crime. The discipline has undergone numerous changes and advances since its first modern use by the psychological/psychiatric community. The current paper reviews the different approaches to criminal profiling, exploring the reasoning and justification utilized across profiling practices. Profiling aims to assist criminal investigators. However, the variance in profiling approaches has contributed to inconsistency across the field, bringing the utility of profiling into question. To address the current areas of practice deficit in criminal profiling, a framework is proposed to promote integrated practice. The crime approach provides a framework consisting of crime scene evaluations, relevancy of research, investigative or clinical opinions, methods of investigation and evaluation, to promote structure and uniformity in profile development, aiming to assist in the reliability of the practice by providing an integrative framework for developing profiles. In its most basic form, criminal profiling, also known as offender profiling and behavioral profiling, among others, is an investigative tool to discern offender characteristics from behavior. This base understanding is common to most, if not all, approaches to profiling, with the main difference between practices being the reasoning and decision-making processes used to arrive at the final profile. Petherick, 2014a, 2014b. Despite the level of scientific reasoning being notably different across the approaches, there has been little attempt to understand what this reasoning is and how it impacts on profile content. Profiling has been subject to discrepancies across practice, with a dearth of processes or principles to promote integrated practice. There have, however, been many attempts to understand more advanced aspects of profiling, such as the accuracy of one group over another, Kosis et al. 2000, Pinizzato and Finkel 1990, or the assistance offered by profilers to end consumers, Cole and Brown 2011, Copson 1995, Mental Health Professionals' Attitudes to Profiling, Torres et al. 2006, and The Operational Utility of Offender Profiling, Gakowski and Gray 2011. Serial killers. A serial murder is, by definition, the unlawful killing of 2 or more victims by the same offenders, in separate events. FBI National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, Serial Murder. The key to understanding a crime is to seek for the motives behind the acts, which come from the killer itself. The making of a serial killer is never clear and doesn't apply precisely to every case, as will be shown later on. Many factors can lead a person to become a violent adult, from causality to mental issues. Causality. Since all human beings are the product of the environment that surrounds them, one of the factors that must be taken into account is causality, how an event can later on cause another event. A major part of a person's development takes place during childhood, when the coping mechanisms first start to progress. The presence of a violent environment can contribute to normalizing such acts and therefore develop the incapacity to dissociate bad from good. In his studies on effects of child abuse, adolescent violence, peer approval, and pro-violence attitudes on intimate partner violence in adulthood, Todd Herrenkohl explains how a cycle of violence exists within families which may lead to the victim becoming, later on, the perpetrator of violence. In some cases, sexual intercourse and gratification are intertwined with violence and, therefore, to abnormals interaction when growing up. All 36 interviews carried by Ressler showed that, quote, the murderers were subjected to serious emotional abuse. It is nonetheless an information that needs to be carefully taken into account, as shown by the study of Mitchell and Amott of Radford University in the incidence of child abuse in serial killers, 2005. Psychopathy. Some common characteristics in serial murderers is the lack of remorse and empathy, a strong impulsivity, and the need for control. All these characteristics are common to the psychopath personality disorder. It is important to underline that psychopathy does not present a total accuracy when it comes to understanding the criminal mind. Not every psychopath is a serial killer, but rather, various serial killers present some psychopathic traits. Many serial murderers have a charming personality, lie pathologically, have great self-esteem, but also antisocial traits and irresponsibility. Often the killers who present said characteristics do not value human life and murder in brutal ways. To this day, what makes profiling difficult is the complexity of the human mind. There is no perfect cataloging for human beings, but rather some similar traits from one to the other. There can always be an exception that undermines the efforts of the perfect criminal profiling. Serial murder claims more than 5,000 victims a year by an estimated 35 serial murderers currently at large in the United States. Motives, gains, and the etiology of serial murder differ from traditional forms of homicide. A typology of serial murderers has been developed that encompasses the spatial mobility of serial killers and visionary, mission, hedonistic, and power/control serial killers. Most serial murderers appear to share certain characteristics: white, age range from 25 to 34 years, intelligent or at least street smart, charming and charismatic, and interested in police work. Profiling a serial murder case involves the analysis of several crime scene traits, including the controlled crime scene, the chaotic crime scene, evidence of torture, specific victim, weapon at scene, relational victim, known victim, violent weapon, aberrant sex, necrophilia, weapon of torture, strangulation, penile penetration, and object penetration. Additional profiling elements are blindfolds, facial attack, body disposal, dismemberment, bondage, body position, and souvenirs. Excerpts from a taped interview demonstrate the serial murderer's perspective of victim selectivity and perceptions during the violent act. The profiling process involves generating insights into an offender's personality, predicting items they may possess, and recommending interrogation strategies once a suspect is identified. While profiling can offer valuable leads, it is not foolproof and should be considered one tool among many in investigative efforts. The field of criminal profiling has evolved significantly since early practitioners, and modern approaches often incorporate empirical research to enhance accuracy. However, it is important to recognize the ethical considerations and limitations inherent in profiling, as it is not an exact science and relies heavily on the experience and judgment of the profiler. Definition: investigatory technique in which a detailed composite description of an unknown perpetrator is constructed on the basis of crime scene evidence. Significance: by providing police officers with descriptive information about what type of individual probably committed an offense, including demographic and psychological characteristics, profiling narrows the range of likely offenders and helps investigators concentrate their limited resources and time in search of suspects. Criminal personality profiling is based on the notion that serial offenders engage in similar patterns of behavior, and that each serial leaves a unique trail with each crime. Profilers believe that the actions of serial offenders are deeply motivated, however bizarre, random, or senseless those actions might appear to untrained observers. The criminal activities in which these offenders engage are windows into their hidden desires, tendencies, and psychological traits. Conversely, these offenders' thoughts, as well as their emotional and sexual needs, drive their criminal behaviors. Serial criminals. Profiling is most often employed in cases of serial homicides or rapes. These crimes, which tend to receive widespread media coverage, often involve female victims with common physical characteristics. The general profile of serial murderers, which matches the actual characteristics of most of the persons apprehended for such crimes, is as follows. They are white men with average or above average intelligence, in their mid-20s to mid-30s, who have an interest in criminal law and police work. Serial killers also tend to be interpersonally adept. They are typically friendly, charming, and engaging, which explains their success at attracting and luring victims to horrific deaths. Other types of serial criminals have also been the subjects of criminal personality profiling, including arsonists, bank robbers, kidnappers, and child molesters. Profilers assume that perpetrators leave telltale signs of their psychopathology at their crime scenes. In the case of serial murderers, the locations where they kill, torture, and mutilate their victims, and in the areas where they conceal their victims' bodies, so-called dump sites. Profilers examine these clues to characterize an unknown, that is, an individual who is likely to have committed the crime given the evidence at the scene. However, they rarely provide police investigators with the specific identity of an actual perpetrator. The three primary tasks of a criminal personality profiler are to generate details about an unknown perpetrator's personality and socio-demographic characteristics, to predict the items that are likely to be discovered in a suspected offender's possession, and to recommend various strategies for suspects in custody. In accomplishing the first of these tasks, the profiler provides police investigators with leads that narrow the pool of unknown suspects with respect to age, race, ethnicity, employment, education, and marital status. Profiling unfolds a biographical sketch of an at-large killer or rapist as the number of that person's crimes increases and more information becomes available to the profiler. Profiling can also give investigators insights into where a perpetrator might live relative to the locations of the crimes. The most important aspect of the profiler's first task is to arrive at an educated guess about a likely offender on the basis of police and autopsy reports, as well as the consistent elements found at different crime scenes, such as how the victims were killed, for example, stabbing, bludgeoning, strangling, suffocating, and how the bodies were positioned or displayed, for example, naked, partially clothed, posed. Based on these data, the profiler can help police officers to focus their attention on a certain type of suspect. The profiler can also provide police with information on where the offender is likely to live, as well as when and where the offender is likely to strike again. The defining aspects of a criminal's behaviors are the individual's MO and signature. The modus operandi consists of the steps the offender follows and the techniques and tools the offender uses when engaging in criminal activities. An offender's MO can evolve. In other words, an individual's criminal skills are honed and practices are modified with experience. As criminals become more seasoned, their MOs becomes more effective and efficient. They also become less likely to leave clues that will lead to their capture. There are several profiles of rapists and sexual assault perpetrators, and one example of an MO is that of the serial rapist who uses tools to pry open the bedroom windows of women sleeping in basement apartments. He wears gloves and thus never leaves fingerprints, and he enters and exits the apartment through the same window. This serial rapist might also display a signature, an action taken not to accomplish the crime but to satisfy the perpetrator's distinctive and perverse psychological needs. For example, the bedroom rapist might force his victims to assume degrading poses while he photographs them following the act of sexual violence. Signatures are unique to specific offenders because they emerge from the offender's idiosyncrasies and personal tendencies. MOs can be replicated by other offenders, but signatures cannot. Offenders who appropriate the MOs of fellow criminals are committing so-called copycat crimes. Signatures are often tied to the pathological sexual satisfaction that serial killers obtain from their offenses. The second profiling task occurs after a prime suspect or person of interest has been identified. Knowledge about the alleged offender's belongings can reinforce other evidence that ties that person to the crimes. For example, some serial killers collect souvenirs, newspaper clippings, photographs, fetish items, pornography, or other materials that help them remember, relive, and recreate their crimes. providing them with prolonged sexual or other types of gratification. The items taken from crime scenes for these purposes are sometimes referred to as, quote, trophies. Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, showcased the macerated skulls and bones of his victims in his apartment and consumed pieces of his victims' flesh to recreate the pleasure he received from sexually violating their corpses. The third profiling task follows the of the suspect. Based on inferences about the suspect's personality traits and psychological disturbances, the profiler guides the police in the selection of interrogation techniques that will best elicit incriminating information from the suspected offender. Different strategies must be implemented with consideration of each suspect's personality and psychological disorders. For example, with some offenders, unrelenting and aggressive questioning is most productive, whereas with others, a more relaxed and conversational tone is most likely to elicit confession. Still, other serial offenders respond best in interrogation situations in which they perceive themselves, rather than the police investigators, as being in full control. I feel like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth. 16-year-old Brian Kohberger typed these words into an obscure internet forum, describing a disconnection from humanity so profound that even his own existence felt meaningless. 6 years later, in the early hours of November 13, 2022, he would enter a house on King Road and slaughter 4 University of Idaho students with the same emotional detachment he once described feeling toward himself. He. Transformation from a depressed teenager to a quadruple murderer raises critical questions. What happens in those dark spaces between emotional pain and violence? How does someone progress from feeling worthless to taking lives so priceless? The search for answers is complicated by hindsight bias. Once we know how a story ends, everything that came before gets filtered through that ending. Once we know someone has become a killer, every odd behavior from their past suddenly seems significant. People who knew Kohberger, stunned by what happened, might unconsciously exaggerate memories. In retrospect, the weird kid from criminology class morphs into an obvious threat. Media coverage also shapes how people remember interactions. Before we know it, every quirk becomes a red flag. But here's the tricky part. Sometimes knowing how the story ends actually does help us understand what came before. It's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle. Once you see the completed picture, you understand why certain pieces fit together. The challenge is distinguishing between forcing pieces to fit, hindsight bias, versus recognizing genuine patterns, retrospective clarity. Think of it this way. If someone is arrested for robbing a bank saying he always seemed interested in money is hindsight bias. Who isn't? But discovering he'd been sketching the bank's floor plan and timing the guards' shifts? That's retrospective clarity, specific preparation for the actual crime. With Kohberger, we'll use this test. Does this behavior make sense only because we know he killed, or does it form part of a specific pattern that connects directly to the murders? For instance, he was a loner, is hindsight bias. Millions of introverts never hurt anyone, but he surveilled the victim's house 12 to 23 times, is retrospective clarity, targeted behavior toward the actual victims. So how do we cut through this fog? I've given it my best shot. I've structured this analysis using what I call a reliability pyramid. At the very top, we have Kohberger's own words, his online posts, his academic papers, his digital footprints from before anyone knew his name. These are unfiltered snapshots of his mind. Next come observations from people who knew him before the murders, classmates, dates, professors who interacted with him when he was just another grad student. Then we have the hard evidence, DNA, cell phone pings, purchase records, crime scene details. At the bottom of our pyramid sits everything that came after, documentaries, retrospective interviews, expert commentary. Useful for context, but we must be careful and take them with a grain of salt. There are also some major gaps in what we know. We don't have access to any therapy notes, medical records, or formal psychological evaluations. Kohberger's July 2nd guilty plea got him life without parole instead of the death penalty, but it also meant no trial where these details might have emerged. His confession admits to the killings, but doesn't explain why. So everything here is based on the evidence available as of July 2025. With those ground rules established, let's dive into what the evidence actually tells us about Brian Kohberger's psychology. The Lost Boy. Brian Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994, in the small Pennsylvania town of Effort. Dad worked maintenance, Mom was a paraprofessional aide, and he had 2 older sisters. Loving parents, middle-class lifestyle. But by the time he was 16, something was seriously wrong. We know this because Kohberger told us himself. On Tapatalk forums, posting under the username XR, he laid out his inner world in painful detail. "I feel like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth," he wrote. When he looked at his family, he felt like he was watching a video game, there but not there, seeing but not feeling. These aren't typical teenage angst posts. It's the writing of someone who feels fundamentally disconnected from themselves and the world around them. Making everything worse was his visual snow syndrome, an unusual neurological condition that creates a constant disturbance in their vision, often described as tiny, flickering dots resembling television static. For someone already feeling disconnected from reality, having an actual visual barrier between himself and the world must have been its own kind of hell. He wrote about suicide. He wrote about feeling nothing. He wrote like someone drowning in plain sight. But the real damage came from his peers. Multiple people who knew him at Pleasant Valley Intermediate and later at Pocono Mountain East High School paint the same picture of a severely overweight, around 300 pounds at one point, child who was tormented mercilessly. This wasn't occasional teasing. This was systematic, daily cruelty, social exclusion, constant mockery, the kind of sustained bullying that doesn't just hurt, it can rewrite how you see yourself and other people. By his mid-teens, he'd found heroin. While other kids were experimenting at parties, Kohberger used alone. Friends noticed his drug use seemed different, more desperate. This wasn't about getting high for fun. The transformation that wasn't. Something shifted when Kohberger hit 17. The overweight, bullied kid decided to take control, and he did it with frightening intensity. Within months, he'd shed over 100 pounds. Friends watched him transform through obsessive veganism, punishing workouts. We're talking 6-minute miles logged on Strava, and martial arts training. On the surface, it looked like an inspiring comeback story. Bullied kid gets fit, gains confidence, wins at life. Except that's not what happened. The people who knew him during this time described something darker. Yes, the weight came off, but as his body hardened, so did something inside him. The formerly quiet, withdrawn kid started mocking others. He positioned himself as the alpha in social groups. One friend put it perfectly. It was like he'd decided that since he'd been the victim, now it was his turn to make others feel small. The bullied became the bully. This transformation is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of Kohberger's story. Many people who overcome severe bullying and obesity go on to become advocates, mentors, or simply kind people who remember their pain and refuse to inflict it on others. Instead, Kohberger's transformation reveals something deeply troubling about how he processes the world and his place in it. Rather than developing empathy from his suffering, he appears to have internalized a zero-sum worldview where there are only victims and victimizers, and he was determined never to be a victim again. This suggests several things about his psychology. He learned the wrong lesson from his trauma. Instead of learning bullying is wrong and causes deep pain, he learned being weak invites abuse, so I must be strong and dominant. His transformation was purely external. He changed his body, but not his wounded psyche. The weight loss was about armor, not healing. He built muscle over broken bones, as you wrote. He sees relationships as power dynamics. His shift from bullied to bully suggests he views human interaction through a lens of dominance and submission, not connection and mutual respect. He lacks the capacity for true empathy. Someone who truly processed their pain would recognize it in others and want to prevent it. His willingness to inflict what he once suffered suggests an empathy deficit that goes beyond normal human failings. Kohberger's choice to flip the script rather than break the cycle reveals someone who views the world as fundamentally hostile and believes the only response is to become hostile in return. It's particularly chilling because it shows his violence wasn't impulsive. It was philosophical. When academic interest becomes something darker, much has been made about Kohberger's choice to study criminology. After getting his bachelor's from Northampton Community College and master's from DeSales University in 2022, he entered the PhD program at Washington State University. His academic work zeroed in on the emotional experience of violence. He wrote papers describing stabbing as an emotional crime, intimate, personal, requiring you to be close enough to feel your victim's last breath. He created a Reddit survey, asking criminals about their feelings during violent acts. This wasn't a broad interest in criminal justice. This was laser-focused on understanding what it feels like to kill. His dating life during this period is equally telling. He'd match with women on apps. Things would start well enough. Then he'd make some awkward comment about their bodies, and they'd ghost him. At Northampton Community College and later DeSales University, women noticed his stares, not quick glances. Prolonged, uncomfortable stares that made them instinctively avoid him. He'd complain to friends about being ignored after sending messages to women who never replied. Each rejection seemed to cut deeper than it should have. For someone with Kohberger's history, every unreturned message probably felt like middle school all over again. Every failed date confirmed what those bullies had told him, that he was worthless, unlovable meat. Multiple people who knew him during college used the same word to describe his social interactions: robotic. He couldn't seem to form genuine connections. But what he could do was stew about it, replace reality with fantasies, and plot his revenge. He was fascinated with Elliot Rodger, the 2014 Isla Vista killer who murdered 6 people and wounded 14 after writing a 140-page manifesto about his rage toward women who'd rejected him. In Kohberger's criminology classes at DeSales, they studied various killers, including Rodger. Most students were horrified by him. Kohberger was fascinated. Multiple classmates confirmed this. While others recoiled from Rodger's self-pitying rants about being denied sex and affection, Kohberger wanted to understand what made him tick. For someone with Kohberger's history of rejection, Rodger's story of turning rejection into revenge must have resonated on a deeply personal level. At Washington State University, Kohberger's behavior raised more concerns. As a teaching assistant, he was harsh with grading, creating conflicts with students. He was disrespectful to female professors. Despite his academic success, he made no real friends. He'd commute to campus and leave immediately after his obligations ended. Then there were the night drives. Multiple people confirmed Kohberger would take long, solitary drives for hours, often in the middle of the night. No destination, no purpose he'd share. In retrospect, these drives feel less like someone clearing their head and more like hunting patterns we see in predatory criminals. But even without hindsight, spending hours alone driving through the darkness instead of sleeping or socializing isn't typical graduate student behavior. The stalking phase. Kohberger's phone pinged near the King Road house where his victims lived at least 12 times in the months before the murders. Some analyses suggest it could have been as many as 23 times. These weren't casual drive-bys. They were surveillance runs, typically conducted in the pre-dawn hours when the neighborhood was asleep. He became a regular at the Mad Greek restaurant where Madison Mogan and Xana Kernodle worked. Staff don't remember him specifically, he was just another customer. But he was there, watching, learning their schedules. Digital forensics later revealed he had sent multiple Instagram DMs to one of the female victims. She never responded. Weeks before the murders, he ordered a Kohberger knife online. This wasn't a weapon grabbed in rage. It was researched, selected, and purchased with purpose. Military style, designed for combat. As November 2022 progressed, his surveillance visits increased. He was building a cognitive map, learning approach routes, escape paths, when the lights went out, and when the street emptied. He was a predator preparing to strike, analyzing the attack. The murders tell us crucial things about Kohberger's psychology. He entered through an unlocked sliding door on the second floor around 4 a.m., showing he knew the layout from his surveillance. He walked past two roommates sleeping on the first floor without harming them. They weren't his targets. This wasn't random violence. He went straight to the third floor, to the room where Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were sleeping in the same bed after a night out. The attack was swift but brutal. DNA under Mogen's fingernails shows she fought back. The knife sheath, containing Kohberger's DNA, was found under her body, suggesting she was the primary focus. Everything about the evidence placement and attack sequence suggests that she is the primary target. After killing Goncalves and Mogen, he went to the second floor. Xana Kernodle was awake. She'd just gotten a DoorDash delivery. She and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, became the next victims. Kernodle's defensive wounds suggest she fought hardest, possibly alerted by sounds from above. The whole attack took minutes, but here's what's psychologically significant. Stabbing is an intimate way to kill. You have to get close. You feel the resistance. You get covered in blood. It's personal in a way that shooting from a distance isn't. This method suggests deep emotional investment in the act. Kohberger then walked past a surviving roommate. He made no attempt to eliminate this witness. He wasn't in a frenzy. He walked calmly out. This control, combined with the targeted nature of the attacks, tells us this was about specific people, not random killing. After the murders, how someone behaves after committing murder sometimes tells us as much as the crime itself. Kohberger turned his phone back on at 4:48 a.m. south of Moscow, creating a digital record of his route home. Then, after taking a congratulatory selfie, he returned to his normal life. He graded papers. He attended classes. He maintained his routine as if he hadn't just butchered 4 people. But he was also paranoid. Family members later noticed he started wearing latex gloves everywhere, even in grocery stores. He obsessively cleaned his car, removing every trace of potential evidence. Yet, despite this forensic awareness, he was a criminology PhD student, after all. He made the fatal error of leaving the knife sheath with his DNA at the crime scene. This suggests that in the moment of violence, emotion overrode his careful planning. The plea, calculated survival. On June 30, 2025, Brian Kohberger made a calculation that revealed as much about his psychology as any of his previous actions. He chose life over principle. After months of his attorneys fighting to bar prosecutors from seeking the death penalty, Kohberger accepted a plea deal that would save his life but seal his fate. 4 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of appeal. The July 2nd hearing before District Court Judge Stephen Hippler was remarkably brief for such a momentous decision. Kohberger stood and answered yes in a flat voice as the judge confirmed each element. Yes, he understood he was pleading guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary. Yes, he admitted the killings were willful, unlawful, deliberate, with premeditation and with malice aforethought. Yes, he planned and carried out the stabbings on November 13, 2022. Each affirmation was delivered without emotion, continuing the pattern of detachment that had characterized his entire life. The deal itself was both comprehensive and curiously incomplete. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Kohberger waived not just his right to appeal, but any future claim to a more lenient sentence. 4 life terms for the murders, plus 10 years for burglary. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison, all consecutive. No parole, no hope of release. Just decades of the same isolation he'd experienced on the outside, now made literal and permanent. Maddeningly, there was no requirement for Kohberger to explain his motive, no obligation to tell the families why he targeted that particular house on King Road. Steve Goncalves, father of victim Kaylee Goncalves, expressed the frustration many felt. After everything, they still didn't have answers. The man who had studied criminal minds would never have to explain his own. Digital shadows, the Papa Roger question. In the weeks following the murders, but before Kohberger's arrest, something curious appeared in online crime discussion groups. A user named Papa Roger began posting about the King Road murders with what appeared to be insider knowledge. While it has never been confirmed that Kohberger was Papa Roger, the coincidences are striking enough to warrant examination within our evidence hierarchy, acknowledging this as unverified but potentially significant information. Gage. Evidence for serial killer trajectory also has considerable merit. Methodical planning, extensive surveillance, successful compartmentalization, apparent lack of remorse, and, if Papa Roger was indeed Kohberger, a need to revisit the crime psychologically. But this, too, falls short as a complete explanation. This was a single, mass event rather than spaced killings. He left crucial DNA evidence. The victims weren't random, but specifically targeted. What emerges instead is someone who embodies characteristics from multiple typologies without fully inhabiting any single one. His academic study of killers provided frameworks, but not rigid adherence to any particular model. His personal grievances motivated target selection but didn't drive him to ideological declaration. His methodical approach suggested serial killer organization but expressed itself in a single, catastrophic event. This complexity itself may be the most important finding. In our urgency to categorize and predict, we risk missing the reality that modern killers may increasingly represent hybrids, shaped by diverse influences from academic study to online culture to personal trauma, creating patterns we haven't seen before. Kohberger studied killers, identified with some, learned from others, but ultimately created his own horrific synthesis. The progression remains clear even if the category doesn't. A bullied, disconnected child grows into a rejected young man who finds academic validation in studying violence, particularly Elliot Rodger's revenge against women. He fixates on Madison Mogen, surveilling her, messaging her, likely seeing in her all his accumulated rejections. The others appear to have been collateral damage, killed because they were present when he came for his primary target. The potential Papa Roger posts suggest someone who needed to intellectually engage with his crime afterward, to maintain some form of connection to what he'd done. But whether we label him an incel, a would-be serial killer, or something else entirely matters less than recognizing the dangerous synthesis he represents. His case warns us against rigid categorization and reminds us that human psychology, even at its darkest, rarely fits neatly into our analytical boxes. Thank you so much for your attention and comments. I am 12 Gage, and this is 12 Gage Investigative. I will break this town tomorrow. Please come back and let's discuss this further. Not for the killers, but for the understanding of criminal-minded murderers, it must be examined. Please like, subscribe, and share. Till then, be safe and watch your six.